Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
French satirical magazine, Charlie Hebdo, is back on the newsstands. We'll explore what it means. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It was just last week that two gunmen entered the offices of the satirical publication and left 12 people dead for cartoons depicting Muhammad. This week, the magazine was back out on the stands with another cartoon of the prophet with a tear in his eye and the line, "All is forgiven." But the reverberations of the killings, along with that of the shooting at a kosher supermarket in Paris, which left 5 people dead, including the shooter, are being felt around the world. On Sunday, 1 million or so gathered in Paris, with some world leaders in attendance showing their support for free speech in the publication. In the Muslim world, there was shock at it all, but also some pushback against this week's cartoon of the prophet. In our studio is David Burns. He's a journalism professor at Salisbury University. And on the phone with us is Dr. Muqtada Khan. He teaches Arab and Middle Eastern politics at the University of Delaware. And welcome to you both. The first question I want to ask, and Muqtada, I want to go with you first. When you heard about the shootings last week, what was your own reaction to it, particularly how it played out in terms of how the media covered it, but how everybody reacted to it?
Well, it came as a big shock to us, and we realized that this was something quite unusual. We have been hearing lots of bad news from the Muslim world lately. Just a week before that, we heard of this terrible massacre of children at the Peshawar Army Public School. Nearly 159 kids were massacred, and the teacher was burnt alive. So the news is really bad, but we realized that this particular act had wider implications than just terrorism, because it might be seen as an assault on the French Republic itself. But it also did have a galvanizing effect. For example, this is the first time that the entire Delaware Muslim community got together and condemned this horrible act. We wrote a letter and it was published in the News Journal. And last night there was a very big turnout for a town hall style meeting at an Islamic school where people came and condemned these attacks. And the Muslim community is very tired with this. And the point that they try to make is that the Muslim community is probably the biggest victim of these terrorist attacks. 90% or more victims are Muslims. And then Muslims also suffer the backlash. And on top of that, those Muslims who have nothing to do with this are expected to apologize or explain and condemn these acts all the time. So there is a tremendous sense of trauma among the Muslims everywhere.
David, I would turn to you. What was your own reaction? And we should, let people know that there was this raid, I guess, in Belgium last night. A couple of people killed, another arrested. Again, somehow connected to what is considered to be a terrorist cell. At least that's how it's being portrayed in the media. What was your own reaction when you saw not only the shootings in Paris, but then the aftermath in terms of how people reacted?
Well, I think that the biggest question that came to my mind after hearing about the initial attacks on Charlie Hebdo was why? Always why. Not what happened and how it happened and so on, which many of the press reports focused on, but the why. I think that there's always a deeper reason for these things happening, and events have to occur to sort of set up what ends up happening. And so that was my biggest reaction. And I think what you're seeing now is, reaction to the reaction. And,
right.
And that is, I think that's pretty common.
Well, by the way, David, what did you make of the fact that we had all these? I mean, I think it was like supposed to be 1 million people or plus. I think in Paris, you saw all these folks come out. The pencil became the sort of the symbol, and "I am Charlie" was the slogan that we saw often. How do you gauge that? I mean, and is this? Do you think this is going to dissipate this solidarity that we're seeing at this point in terms of the world?
When I see the "Je suis Charlie" slogan and the "I am Charlie," and I see the reaction that happened over the weekend, where millions of people come out, especially the political figures, there's a part of me that has to laugh just a little bit because Charlie Hebdo is a political satirist publication. And so the people who many times were lampooned within the pages of Charlie Hebdo were sitting arm in arm, walking in the very front of the line. And I think that to take that and extrapolate it just a little bit, Charlie Hebdo was all about secularism, and it was all about holding no one above anyone else. And so to see the people who are being lampooned saying "Je suis Charlie" was, I think, the editors and the editor-in-chief who were killed might have found that a little ironic.
Mukhtar, you wrote a piece and you talked about things that need to be done, including dialogue with the West and Muslim dialogue. Explain a little bit what your thinking was in terms of your assessment of how these...
Well, see, there are double confusions going on. For example, since the massive turnout in solidarity with France, and especially reaffirming the freedom of speech, nearly 54 people have been arrested in France for making statements. For example, a very prominent Muslim comedian was arrested for making a Facebook statement. So Muslims around the world are quite horrified. I've been doing media all day, yesterday and today, and one of the questions that Muslim media is asking is, can you just explain to us what you people in the West mean by freedom of speech? Because just because someone puts something on Facebook, you arrest him. And so what are we to understand? So there is this constant accusation of double standards, especially against European countries who have all kinds of hate speech laws. For example, if you were to condemn the Holocaust or deny the Holocaust, you would go to jail for 5 years automatically in France. In Italy, apparently you can't insult a priest. And so there are all these regulations in France which control free speech. Apparently the only thing that you can do freely in Europe these days is insult the Prophet of Islam. You can make caricatures, you can make horrible movies and so on. So Muslims are quite upset, and this is a serious dialogue that Muslims need to have about West to understand what is the relationship and the future of Muslims in Europe. That is one thing. The other thing is that the backlash against events such as this tends to generalize. And as a result of that, there is racial profiling, etc., and Muslims who have nothing to do with this also face consequences. Additionally, in Europe, Muslims suffer from racism, discrimination in the marketplace. For example, I also put out a video asking the question that why are we talking about Islam? These two people who committed this crime were born in France. They are French. They grew up in France. They're product of French culture and French Enlightenment and French secularism. So why doesn't France also take some blame or credit for the activities of these? What is it about European societies that so many of their minority people are getting radicalized? What is it that is alienating the society about European culture? These are serious questions. And it's not just Muslims, people who are converting to Islam. Like this person in Ohio who was arrested just yesterday. He converts to Islam, nobody knows about it, no interaction with Muslims, and decides to blow up the Capitol. So what is it about Western culture which is alienating its youth and radicalizing them? This is a serious dialogue which we need to have without pointing fingers at just Islam. And then on the other hand, there is a strain of extremism in the Muslim world which is going on. For example, if you were to Google what is the punishment for insulting Islam, you will find many fatwas or scholarly opinions from very prominent scholars in the Muslim world who say that anybody who insults the Prophet should be killed. So when you're listening to scholars in the Muslim world like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they are saying anybody who insults Islam or the Prophet of Islam should be killed. And Muslim scholars here are reading the same sources, and we do not see that in the sources. And we are realizing that it is important for Muslims also to have a dialogue and say, look, we have, in this age of globalization, we all have to be on the same page. And it's not just for the sake of appearances, it's also for the sake of our future. Yesterday in Delaware, we had this dialogue, and when a young man stood up and said, I don't understand my religion anymore. I'm so confused. You tell me that this is a religion of tolerance and peace, and the Prophet himself never reacted in such a way. And then I listened on YouTube to people who are very prominent scholars in the Muslim world, and they are telling me another way. But the problem is that in Pakistan, everybody is reacting to the drones, to the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. In the Arab world, people are reacting largely to what is happening in Palestine and Gaza. So the mixture of geopolitics and theology has created a very confusing, shall we say, cocktail of emotions for the Muslim youth worldwide. And for that, it is very important that Muslims have a very serious dialogue to isolate and contain, if not eliminate, this theological extremism. But unfortunately, there are some countries where it is very deeply embedded, like in Saudi Arabia.
David, what about the idea about the double standard? That is, that certainly Europe is extremely sensitive to anti-Semitism because of the history coming out of the Second World War with Nazi Germany.
I couldn't hear the question properly.
Talking to David here a moment. I was asking David what he thought about this issue about the double standard and this idea that, and Europe certainly has a special history when it comes to anti-Semitism. That's very, very clear. What about that? And when Muslims look out at what's going on in Europe, David, they see a double standard where Europeans don't necessarily see it.
Well, I think that using French press law is, you can't compare the U.S. press law to French press law. French press law is very restricted, strict defamation, strict privacy laws, and they're really clamping down on online comments. We mentioned a little bit earlier about the Facebook posting from the French comedian from Cameroon who made a comment, and that the French government is sort of clamping down on that. I think that, and there are, by the way, laws, French press laws that do, it's an offense to incite racial hatred, discrimination, violence, or question crimes against humanity. The Holocaust being one of those examples. So is there a double standard? I kind of think there is in France because, for example, the female headdress is banned, along with, they prohibit wearing signs or clothing with religious affiliations, and they make that leap, and they say, well, a woman who covers their face, that's a religious statement. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that would be like saying Amish people who wear Amish men who wear the black hats would be wearing a religious symbol. I don't think that's necessarily true. So is there a double standard? I think in many ways they are ultra sensitive to the Holocaust. I think that in many ways they are not defending these laws in the exact same way. I also think that Charlie Hebdo was a equal opportunity offender. They attacked Judaism, Christianity, Islam fairly equally in many cases. I've heard a lot of comparisons between the Charlie Hebdo publication and Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. I don't necessarily think that is a good comparison. I think maybe Charlie Hebdo might be better compared to a show like South Park.
Let me ask you this, Muqtada, in terms of how the Arab community is reacting, particularly in terms of other countries. I mean, we did have this solidarity of the Iranians, for instance, said that the shooting was not acceptable. But one of the things that struck a lot of folks, particularly in terms of the million people or so, and the leaders that showed up in Paris, that there were some people, like from Saudi Arabia, who not only at the one point was marching in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo, but on the other hand, they had the flogging of a blogger. There seems to be, I mean, how do we make sense of those contradictions?
Well, if you notice, one of the internet memes that has come out is a mockery of that famous, some people are calling it iconic picture of the French Prime Minister marching with global leaders, and others are laughing at it because, for example, Netanyahu is marching with them. Netanyahu just killed 7 journalists in Gaza. You have a representative of the Egyptian government, which was ill-treating the reporters from Al Jazeera. There was a Turkish prime minister, and for the last 2-3 years, Turkey has had literally hundreds of journalists in prison. So countries where freedom of speech doesn't even exist. In Saudi Arabia, I mean, not only are people being flogged for making comments on Twitter, but there is no freedom of expression, no freedom of religion. So what are they standing in solidarity for? The question really is that some are standing in solidarity against what they see as Islamic extremism. So for Saudi Arabia and Egypt, this is a way of saying that we are standing with the West against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then for Netanyahu, he's trying to say basically, all Palestinians are terrorists like these people, so the Europe should stand for Israel as Israel is standing for Europe. And so there are different agendas. This Charlie Hebdo episode is now being used by a lot of people to advance different political agendas. In fact, in yesterday's discussion, it was very interesting. There were lots of people who were raising the issue that there is double standards on freedom of speech across the board in Europe. For example, it is not necessarily that the Muslim world should accept Western claims that the freedom of speech or freedom to mock other religions is an important value. There is no reason why we should accept that when we say that the respect for Prophet and God and holy texts are important. Because if you remember, when the Patriot Act was passed in the United States, people kept saying that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. So we went and compromised many of the values that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights for the sake of security. And so those are the same issues that are being raised in France, that you will violate freedom of speech, freedom of religion, boycott, ban hijab, ban burqa, etc., but not prohibit hate speech against the Prophet of Islam in the interest of solidarity, security, and peace. But then there were others who were arguing that in France, particularly, it is not about freedom of speech, but it is about defending secularism. So in many ways, people were standing in solidarity against religion itself, not just Islam, but religion itself. And that's why you see a counter-argument coming from the Pope, who is also calling for limiting freedom of speech when it comes to insulting religion and religious values. This is a challenge, even in the United States, where probably the U.S. is probably the only country where you have near absolute freedom of speech. Those caveats that exist in Europe do not exist in the United States. But nevertheless, even in the U.S., as one of the experts yesterday was explaining, that freedom of speech can become prohibited if it becomes conduct, such as the word assault, for example, in legal terms, is actually a speech act. And therefore, it is a contention issues, and sometimes it is a reflection of politics. If Muslims were powerful enough in European society, they can deal with it in many ways. For example, it doesn't occur to me. It occurred to me as to why some rich Muslim would not just buy something like Charlie Hebdo and fire all these editors. Like in the United States, if you remember this guy called Sanchez, who was a reporter on CNN, he made one anti-Semitic comment and his career is finished. The guy has disappeared. Rick Sanchez, who was a host on CNN. And Muslims in the West need to be able to, there are ways to get around these so-called Western values where the civil society backlash is very extreme, and so on and so forth. So Muslims have to learn. But unfortunately in Europe, they are a marginalized minority. They are the racial other. They are poor. They do not have opportunities. Plus, they are very close. It's 3 hours from Syria, 4 hours from Iraq. And so the proximity to the chaos in the Muslim world further aggravates Muslim minorities there, not so much here.
But Dr. Mukhtar, I'm going to turn to David here in a moment, but I do want to say that I appreciate you joining us here. That's Dr. Mukhtar Khan. He teaches Arab and Middle Eastern politics at the University of Delaware. I appreciate you joining the program.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
Thank you. David, so what about, we often hear this thing about, I believe in free speech, but, and you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't do that, but you should, and even the Pope talks about, I believe in free speech, but you shouldn't insult religion. Explain that contradiction, or that.
Oh, well, I can't explain it because I don't agree with it. I think free expression, that, we need to protect all speech. We need to protect speech that it's the most important thing is to protect speech that we don't agree with. That's why it's there. Free speech is not to go along with what the status quo is. It's to protect the extremes. And I think that's what political satire does. The thing to me about blasphemers and satirists that they do for a society is they help frame the issue by looking at the extremes. And that allows people like you and I to have conversations in the middle, that it's safe to have conversations somewhere in those in that middle. But I see the Pope, I see these people as political figures, not just religious figures, but political figures. I agree that the march this past weekend was a political move.
Event, yeah.
It was a political event, which again I think that the victims of the shooting would find completely ironic, that they're being held up as that their misfortune is being politicized and so on. But the idea here is to frame the issue. And I think press freedom protects everybody and needs to protect everybody. I've lived in cultures where there is no press freedom, where there is no free speech. And I can tell you those systems are not functioning.
We have now joined by Waqar Sharif. He's Vice President of the Islamic Society of Delaware, also a member of the Islamic Circle of North America. Welcome to the program. And Waqar, so what was your own reaction when you saw the shootings? And was interested as to what you think those shootings and obviously some of the aftermath means for the Muslim community.
Thank you, Don, for having me. I heard the comments by Dr. Muqtadir Khan and Dr. David Burns, and I'm very glad that in such a short amount of time you have covered very good points. I just like to add that bring everybody's attention to this very underreported event that took place on December 31st in Yemen, where a suicide bomber blew himself up, mostly killing Shiites. 49 people were killed. Now, how that event has a similarity with the event that took place in Paris. So both took place in the name of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Those 49 people in Yemen, they were killed and murdered because they were celebrating the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. And then these people in France that were murdered were in the eyes of these murderers, they disrespected. So they were being avenged for the disrespect of Prophet Muhammad. So these two things happen. And what I draw a conclusion from these two is that French and European people think that it was the attack on freedom of expression, and their values. The Muslims also saw that, heard that, read about this, and So the Europeans, other people who are non-Muslim are thinking this is the war between West and Islam. And Muslims are simply saying, oh, these terrorists are not Muslims, and just shove them apart. And then to say that is not enough. What is happening here is this ideology, these people who have this ideology and mentality, what they are trying to do is they are trying to force people to give up their respective traditions, their freedom. They're being intimidated by taking lives by force. So this is the ideology, and it is threatening everyone. And ironically, these are very few people. So in my opinion, the entire Muslim communities all over the world, which is amount to more than 1 billion people, should not be subjected. So we have to come up with a strategy together. It's not something that the Muslims can fight against this ideology alone, because we are all interlinked. Even people from the West, we all have to come up with a strategy to fight against this ideology.
But Carl, let me ask you just briefly. We only have about a minute or two left. How much of this is just simply the conflict that has now arisen between the Shiite community and the Sunni community, which, at least over the long term, has not, at least in my view, has not seen this kind of conflict, which is eventually created this kind of violence, not just occurring in France and the West, but even within the Islamic community?
Again, this ideology, this fight between Shiites and Sunni, it's not between the majority, between the two big masses. It is against, once again, these very few people whose ideology is that only they are right and everything which doesn't fit their ideology is wrong. So this is the fight, because you will see not masses going to fight with Shiites, or Shiites, not all of them getting together coming to fight with Sunnis. It is only one suicide bomber going in and blowing himself up and killing the Shias.
David, just real quickly, about 30 seconds.
I think that, I'm hearing people saying, this is not a statement about press freedom, it's a statement against something else. I think it's a statement of both. It can be both things at the same time. Obviously, this is a media organization that was brutally attacked. It is, by definition, an attack on the press. All right. The other thing it is a very good statement. I get to the why. I started by saying you got to ask why. Why did this happen? Because there's a cultural dystopia going on in France right now. The people who are living in suburbs, they're not really suburbs. They are enclaves where the unemployment rate is sky high. For young people, it's 4 times the rate of the national average of unemployment. These people are become desperate. They also go outside of France and they study in places like Syria and whatnot, and then they come back. They're looking for direction. They're looking for a solution. They're desperate. You've got to be fairly marginalized in a society in order to take extreme action. I think that the cultural dystopia that's happening in France was part of the why this happened when those people walked into that press organization.
We've been speaking with David Burns. He's the journalism professor here at Salisbury University. Also, Bakar Sharif, Vice President of the Islamic Society of Delaware and a member of the Islamic Circle of North America. Appreciate you joining us. And earlier we had Dr. Muqtada Khan. He teaches Arab and Middle Eastern politics at the University of Delaware. I'm Don Rush. This has been Delmarva Today. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.